The axe falls once, twice, and on the third swing, the trunk splits into two perfect halves that fall on either side of his boot. There is no word, only the sound of wood cleaving the cold morning air, the steam of his breath, and behind him, peeking just from the window of a kitchen with peeling paint, a woman watching him without his knowledge, a cup of coffee long gone cold between her hands. He doesn't live there. No one asked him to chop this wood. And yet, for 3 weeks, he's been doing it every morning, before the sun has fully risen, before the children wake, before anyone can thank him or ask him why. The farm was called Heron's Bend, though no heron had nested there in anyone alive's memory. It was a patch of hard earth and broken promises, on the outskirts of a town barely mentioned on maps, in a territory where winter arrived early and summer departed without warning. Sarah Calloway was 32, with a way of walking that seemed to constantly calculate how many steps it would take to finish whatever she was doing. She had buried her husband 18 months ago, in a plot behind the barn, marked only by a flat stone. And since then, she had learned to do alone what two had done before: milk, plant, mend fences, soothe the fear of 2 children who no longer asked when their father would return, because they had understood, in their own childish and terrible way, that he wasn't coming back. She had a son, Daniel, 9 years old, who had decided crying was for little kids, and he wasn't one anymore. And a daughter, Ruth, 6, who still set an extra plate at the table some nights, without anyone telling her to, without anyone daring to take it away. The man chopping wood was named Thomas Hale. He had arrived in town in the autumn, riding a horse that seemed as tired of the road as he was, and had taken up residence at the village inn without offering any explanation beyond, "I work where work is needed." His hands were those of someone used to tools, his back of someone used to carrying, and his eyes of someone who said no more than he was asked. No one knew where he came from. No one, in that first month, dared to ask too insistently, because there was something in his silence that invited not curiosity, but a kind of cautious respect, like that given to a large animal that has shown no intention of harming anyone, but also hasn't proven otherwise. Sarah met him on a Tuesday when he entered the general store to buy nails, and she was leaving with her arms full of flour, her gaze lost in some calculation that wasn't adding up. They collided, literally, his shoulder against her bag, flour cascading in a white cloud over both their boots. He apologized with few words, bent to pick up what he could salvage, and when he looked up to hand it to her, she saw something in his expression she couldn't name then. It wasn't interest. It wasn't pity. It was more like recognition, as if he had seen in her something he knew by heart. The peculiar weight of carrying alone what should be carried by 2. They didn't talk much that day. But 2 weeks later, when a storm that ripped off roofs swept through the valley, Sarah went out at dawn and found the chicken coop, which had a gap she hadn't had time to repair for months, was closed with new boards, nailed with a precision she wouldn't have bothered to achieve, so tired was she always. There was no note. No one stayed to be thanked. Only the work, done, as if it had appeared by its own will. She asked around town. Someone mentioned having seen the stranger near the farm that night, before the storm. No one could tell her why. What neither of them had said aloud in those first weeks was this: that they both recognized in the other the same kind of weariness. The weariness of one who has carried alone for a long time and has stopped expecting anyone to ask if they need help. Sarah hadn't told anyone, not even herself, clearly. But there were days when she would sit on the edge of her bed after putting the children to sleep and wonder how much longer she could hold it all together before something, somewhere inside her, silently broke, like a beam giving way without warning. Thomas, for his part, carried something different, but equally heavy. Something he didn't talk about. Something in the way he avoided certain questions, and the way his eyes would fix on the horizon when anyone mentioned family or where are you from? As if those words touched a place he preferred not to name. One November morning, Daniel went out to find the stranger before anyone in the house knew he was gone. He found him repairing a wagon wheel on the neighboring property, sweat trickling down his neck despite the cold. The boy stood at a safe distance, hands in his pockets, watching. "Why are you doing that?" he finally asked, without introducing himself, without greeting. Thomas didn't look up from his work. "Doing what?" "Fixing things that aren't yours." There was a long silence, the kind that only children dare to sustain without discomfort. Thomas finally put down the tool, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked at the boy with a seriousness Daniel didn't expect. "Because someone left them broken," he said. "And sometimes you just want things to work again. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that." Daniel didn't fully understand, but something in that answer stayed with him. That night, at dinner, he told his mother what he had seen, what the man had said. Sarah listened in silence, stirring the soup she had barely touched, and said nothing. But something inside her began to stir with the slowness of someone who has for a long time not allowed themselves to feel anything new. Thomas started appearing more often, never announced, never asked for. He repaired the barn roof on a Saturday while Sarah was in town. He left chopped wood by the back door when the temperature dropped. One afternoon, without anyone asking, he sat on the porch with Ruth and taught her to carve a small wooden figure, a clumsy, charming horse that the little girl kept under her pillow that very night, as if it were the most valuable object she owned. Sarah began leaving coffee for him in a different cup, one that had belonged to her husband, without thinking too much at first, until one day she realized what she had done and stood there with the coffee pot in her hand, feeling something akin to guilt and something akin to something else she didn't want to name yet. But what neither of them knew yet was that the whole town had already started talking, and that those conversations, those rumors murmured among well-intentioned neighbors and others less so, would soon bring consequences neither of them had anticipated. On Sundays, Sarah and the children went to the village church, a white wooden building with a crooked steeple that no one had ever bothered to straighten. It was there that news circulated faster than anywhere else, where glances were exchanged with a meaning that words didn't need to complete. "That man has been hanging around Widow Calloway's property for weeks," commented a woman named Edith Mercer to anyone who would listen, with the tone of someone sharing a secret they actually want everyone to know. "Nobody knows where he comes from. Nobody knows what he's after." What Edith didn't say, but everyone understood, was the real question beneath her words. What kind of man helps a single woman without asking for anything in return? The answer, the town had decided, without proof, without needing it, was that such a man surely wanted something. The land, perhaps, or something worse. There was, moreover, another man in town who had his own reasons for fueling those rumors. His name was Garrett Holt, owner of the mill and half the debts circulating among the local farmers. And he had been courting Sarah for over a year with the calculated patience of someone who knows that time eventually plays in their favor. He had offered her on more than one occasion to buy part of her land at a generous price, to lighten the load, he would say, though everyone knew that land bordered his own and that his generosity had the exact shape of his own interest. Garrett saw something he didn't like in Thomas. It wasn't just romantic competition, though that weighed too. It was the way the children looked at him, the way Sarah, without realizing it, had started to smile in a way Garrett had never managed to provoke in her in over a year of carefully spaced visits and precisely calculated gifts. So Garrett started asking questions. Discreet at first. At the bar, in the store, anywhere a man could casually mention that it was strange, wasn't it, that nobody knew anything about the stranger. That a man with no known past was so comfortable around a woman and her children. The questions, sown with care, began to bear fruit. And one day, that fruit reached Sarah's ears in the rawest way possible. A comment made deliberately in front of her, in the general store, by a neighbor who pretended not to notice she was there. They say there was a man with the same description a few years ago in a town to the north. They say there were problems. They say he left overnight, without explanation. Sarah didn't ask further. She didn't want to know who was saying it, or if it was true. But that night, when Thomas arrived as he did every evening, with a basket of apples he'd picked on the way to the farm, she greeted him with a new, cold distance that he noticed immediately, even if he didn't understand why. "Is something wrong?" he asked, setting the basket on the porch floor. "Is there something I should be asking you, Thomas?" she replied, her voice trying to sound firm and only managing to sound hurt. "Something about where you were before you came here?" The silence that followed was different from all the previous ones. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of two people who don't need to fill the air with words. It was the silence of someone deciding whether to trust enough to risk being seen completely, with all their cracks. "There are things about my past I haven't told," Thomas finally said, looking at the ground. "But they're not what you're thinking." "And what am I supposed to think then? I have 2 children, Thomas. I can't afford to trust a man who doesn't tell me who he is." He nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer from the beginning, as if he had already lived this same scene before, in another place, with another name on his lips. He turned and left without another word, leaving the basket of apples on the porch, and Sarah stood there, feeling that she had gained something she didn't want, and lost something she had only just begun to allow herself to desire. Psychologists call this preventive threat attribution, the human tendency extensively documented by researcher Brené Brown in her work on vulnerability and trust to reject emerging intimacy before it can hurt us, even when that very intimacy might be exactly what we need. 3 days passed without Thomas appearing at the farm. 3 days in which Sarah found herself looking towards the road more than she would have liked to admit, in which Daniel asked twice where Mr. Hale was, and in which Ruth slept with the wooden horse clutched to her chest, as if fearing it too might disappear. Winter arrived with force that week, earlier than expected, with a frost that froze the well and left the farm without running water the morning Daniel woke up with a fever. Sarah, alone, with a sick son and a frightened daughter, did what she could. She walked to town through the snow to find the doctor, left Ruth with a neighbor, and spent the entire night by Daniel's bedside, changing cold cloths on his forehead, whispering prayers she didn't remember learning from anyone. It was Thomas who found the well's problem while passing by, almost by accident, carrying something he no longer clearly remembered why he had decided to bring. He saw the chimney smoke die down prematurely, knew something wasn't right, and entered without asking permission, finding Sarah exhausted, with red eyes, trying to heat water on a fire that barely caught. He said nothing about the distance of the past few days. He asked for no explanations, nor expected apologies. He simply took off his coat, got the fire going properly, went out to break the ice on the well with silent determination, and by dawn, Daniel's fever was more controlled, and Sarah had managed to sleep without realizing it, leaning against the kitchen wall, exhausted to the limit of what a body can sustain. When she woke up, she found a blanket on her shoulders that she didn't remember putting on, and Thomas sitting by Daniel's bed, watching his breathing with the same silent attention with which he watched everything else. "You didn't have to come back," she said, her voice breaking, not from fatigue but from something deeper. "I know," he replied, "but you needed someone to come back." That sentence, simple as it was, opened something in Sarah that had been locked for 18 months. It wasn't a shout or an overflowing cry. It was quieter than that. The tears that finally fall when a person stops carrying the whole weight alone, even if only for a single night. She told him then what she had heard in town. She told him about Garrett, about the rumors, about the fear she felt not just for herself but for her children, for the possibility of making a mistake again in something so important. Thomas listened to it all without interrupting, and when she finished, he remained silent for another moment, as if deciding something important with himself. "I had a wife," he finally said, "and a son, in a town to the north, like the rumors say. That part isn't a lie." Sarah felt the air leave her chest. "They died," he continued, his voice having become lower, rougher. "An illness took them both in the same week 3 years ago. I left that town because I couldn't keep living in a house that shaped itself like everything I had lost. I didn't leave because I did anything wrong. I left because staying was killing me slower than I would have liked." The silence that followed was not the silence of before. It was different. The silence of two people finally seeing each other clearly, without the shadows of what the town had built between them. "That's why you do all this," Sarah said, suddenly understanding. "The firewood, the repairs, the children." "At first I didn't know clearly," he admitted. "But yes, I think so. There's something about fixing what's broken that feels like it can fix the other thing too, what can't be fixed." She said nothing more that night, but something had changed between them, something that no word could have precisely named, but which they both felt with the same clarity as the changing of seasons, even before the first snowflake falls. Garrett, however, was not finished. When he learned, from the same Edith Mercer who so enjoyed spreading news, that Thomas had spent the night at Sarah's farm, he decided it was time to act more directly. He went to see her a couple of days later, with flowers that weren't local and a proposal he had been preparing for months. "Sarah, I know times have been difficult," he said, sitting in the living room with a cup of tea she had served him out of courtesy rather than desire. And I know that man has been helping with some things, but you need real stability. You need a man with a name, with a known history, with something to offer beyond good intentions. And what do you offer, Garrett? My land, my name, a life without the worries that have plagued you since your husband died. Your children would have everything they need. You wouldn't have to chop wood with your own hands again. Sarah looked at him for a long time, weighing not the offer itself, but what that offer revealed about how Garrett saw her. As a problem to solve, as a burden to lighten, not as a person with her own will. She thought of Thomas, how he had never offered her anything for nothing, how each of his gestures had been an unconditional act, with no expectation of return. I appreciate the offer, Garrett, but no. Garrett's face hardened for just an instant, enough for her to see, for the first time clearly, what lay beneath his careful courtesy. You'll regret this, he said, standing up. That man will leave one day, just as he arrived, and you'll be alone again, this time with no one in town willing to offer you a second chance. He left without waiting for a reply, leaving the flowers on the table. Flowers that Sarah threw away that same afternoon without a second thought. But Garrett's words, though spoken with malice, found a place in her that already harbored its own doubts. Because it was true. Thomas had never spoken of staying. He had never made promises. He had appeared like the weather, without announcement, and could just as easily leave the same way, leaving her again with the full weight on her shoulders, this time aggravated by the recent habit of having shared it. That night, as she was putting Ruth to bed, the little girl asked something that tipped the scales within her. Mom, is Mr. Hale going to stay forever? Sarah didn't know what to answer. In that silence, that inability to give a simple answer to a simple question, told her more about what she felt than any conversation she had had with herself in weeks. What was the use of protecting herself from future pain if it meant giving up the only thing that had made her feel, after 18 months, that she was still capable of wanting something with her whole being? The days passed, and Thomas continued to appear, completely unaware of Garrett's visit, of the doubts that now circled Sarah more insistently. But she began to notice something different in him, too. A new disquiet. A way of looking at her that seemed to be saying goodbye to something, before she knew there was something to say goodbye to. One afternoon, while he was repairing the corral fence, she approached with 2 cups of coffee, a habit that had become so natural between them that neither of them questioned it anymore. Are you going to stay, Thomas? She asked directly, without preamble, because she had decided she had had enough of unanswered questions. He put down the hammer and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between fear and relief at finally having to face the question. I don't know, he admitted. I've been moving from place to place for 3 years because staying anywhere starts to feel like risking losing something again. It's easier not to have anything to lose. And here? Does it feel like that too? The silence that followed lasted longer than either of them would have liked. And when he finally spoke, his voice had a tremor Sarah hadn't heard before. It's different here, and that scares me more than anything else I've felt in 3 years. Before continuing, it's worth pausing. From what country are you watching us today? Tell us in the comments. We love to know from where in the world this story is reaching you. That same night, after the children had fallen asleep, Sarah went out onto the porch, wrapped in a thick shawl, and found Thomas sitting on the steps, looking out at the dark field as if searching there for an answer he couldn't find anywhere else. "I'm scared," she said, sitting down beside him, without preamble, because she had decided the time for beating around the bush was over. "Not of you, of myself, of wanting something again and losing it, of my children wanting something again and losing it. We've already lost enough." "I'm scared too," he replied. "Every morning I come here, a part of me thinks I should leave before this becomes something I can't bear to lose. But there's another part, stronger, that doesn't want to leave, that hasn't wanted to leave since the first time I saw Daniel, trying to carry more wood than his body could handle, just so you wouldn't have to." Sarah felt something in her chest loosen, like a rope stretched too long that finally finds relief. "Then stay," she said, with a simplicity that contained everything she couldn't say in more words. "Not because you have to fix something, not because you feel you have to earn a place here. Stay because you want to, and see what happens." Thomas looked at her then in a way she would never forget. Not with the urgency of someone seeking an answer, but with the quiet of someone who has finally found it. "I don't know how to do this without being scared," he admitted, "but I want to try. With you, with Daniel, with Ruth, if you'll let me." "I'm not asking you not to be scared, Thomas. I'm asking you to stay anyway." What followed wasn't a movie kiss, nor a perfect declaration with rehearsed words. It was clumsier than that, more real. Their hands finding each other in the space between them, a shared silence that said more than any speech, and finally, a simple hug, the first one, that lasted longer than either of them had planned, as if neither wanted to be the first to let go. The days that followed had a different quality, as if the air itself had changed density. Thomas continued to work the land, but now he did so with the children nearby, teaching Daniel to handle tools carefully, letting Ruth help nail boards that he would later, secretly, adjust correctly. Sarah discovered she laughed more often than she remembered. Not because life had suddenly become easier, but because she had someone with whom to share the burden of it not being so. Garrett, upon learning that his last move had failed, decided to make a final attempt, this time more cruel. He spread the rumor that Thomas had abandoned his family. Not that they had died, but that he had left them of his own will, fleeing his responsibilities. The lie spread quickly, as lies spread when they find fertile ground in others' fear. Sarah heard the distorted version from the mouth of a well-intentioned neighbor who only wanted to warn her. And for the first time in weeks, she felt the old distrust trying to make its way through again. But this time, instead of staying silent, instead of distancing herself without explanation, she went directly to Thomas and repeated what she had heard, giving him the opportunity to respond before doubt could take root. "There is a grave in the north with my wife's and son's names on it," Thomas said, without anger, only with the weariness of someone who has had to defend their own pain too many times. "I can take you there if you need to see it with your own eyes. I didn't flee from anything, Sarah. I survived something I shouldn't have had to survive, and that, apparently, gives people the right to invent a better story than the truth." Sarah didn't need to see the grave. What she needed was to see on his face that the truth cost him to tell, and that telling it anyway, without sugarcoating it, was exactly the kind of honesty she had been looking for without knowing it. "I believe you," she said simply, "and I'm sorry for doubting, even if it was only for an instant." That same week, Garrett tried one last strategy. He offered to buy the outstanding debt Sarah still owed the town bank, a debt inherited from her late husband that she had been paying slowly month by month. His plan was simple and cruel: to become her direct creditor with the power to pressure her whenever he wished. But the bank owner, a man named Walter Briggs, who had known Sarah since she was a child and had watched Garrett's maneuvers with growing disapproval, refused to sell the debt, citing an ancient loyalty to her late husband's family that no business, however generous it seemed, could buy. Garrett, defeated in all his attempts, finally withdrew from the town a few months later, moving his business to a larger city where his methods would presumably find more fertile ground. Thomas and Sarah, now free of that particular shadow, built their life together with the patience of those who have learned, the hard way, that good things are worth time. He moved into a small cabin he repaired himself at one end of the property, not because distance was needed, but because they both agreed the children deserved to see that respect and time mattered as much as feeling. The wedding, when it came, was small, almost silent. In the farm garden, with Daniel delivering the rings with a solemn seriousness that made everyone present laugh, and Ruth scattering wildflowers with an enthusiasm no protocol could have contained. Walter Briggs officiated, because it turned out that in his youth he had been a preacher before dedicating himself to numbers. And his words, simple and unadorned, were exactly what the occasion called for. "I don't promise to fix everything," Thomas said in his vows, looking not only at Sarah, but also at the two children standing beside her. "I promise to keep trying, every day, even though some things can't be fixed. I promise that as long as I can hold a hammer, there will be nothing broken in this family that I won't try to repair, and nothing that breaks that we won't face together." The years that followed had the ordinary and extraordinary texture of a life built together. Good harvests and bad harvests, harsh winters and generous summers. The arrival of a third child 2 years after the wedding, a son whom Thomas insisted bear the name of Sarah's first husband, a gesture she could never fully thank him for with words, because words were insufficient for something like that. Daniel grew to become a man, with his stepfather's hands and his biological father's determination, both coexisting in him without contradiction. Ruth, years later, would tell her own children the story of the wooden horse, carved by a stranger who chopped wood without anyone asking, keeping the small object, worn by time, as a relic that would pass from generation to generation. 20 years after that first morning when Sarah watched him from the window without his knowledge, Thomas still woke up early, though now with a slower body, joints stiffer from a lifetime of work. And Sarah, with her hair already graying at the temples, still left him coffee in the same cup, the one that had belonged to her first husband. Because at some point in those 20 years, she had stopped feeling that it was a betrayal to anyone's memory, and had begun to feel that it was, simply, another way to honor all that she had been capable of loving in a single life. One autumn afternoon, with the light falling golden on the fields they had worked together for 2 decades, Sarah found Thomas sitting on the same porch where he had once confessed his fear. Now repairing, with slower but equally firm hands, the same rocking chair in which she used to sit, watching the children when they were small. "Still fixing things," she said, sitting beside him. her hand finding his with the naturalness of 20 years of practice. "There will always be something to fix," he replied, without looking up from his work, a barely visible smile at the corners of his mouth. "But I no longer do it because I'm afraid of standing still. I do it because I like doing it with you close." She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the familiar scent of wood and earth that she had never stopped associating with security, with home, with the quiet certainty that some people don't come into our lives to stay for a while, but to stay, period, until time itself decides it has been enough. Because in the end, this is what few stories dare to tell: that the most lasting love doesn't always arrive with fireworks or grand promises. Sometimes it arrives in silence, with an axe chopping wood at dawn, with a wagon wheel repaired without anyone asking, with a man who decides, on any given morning, that perhaps he still has something to offer the world, even if the world hasn't asked for it. And if you ever find yourself doubting whether you deserve that kind of silent, constant love, remember this: sometimes the greatest proof of affection is not in the words someone says, but in what that person keeps doing, day after day, without anyone asking and without expecting anything in return.